Welcome to our program regarding values. We have four eminent speakers here, all who live and work according to values. Now, the world has changed a lot, even in the last 20 years, but we're going to take a wider lens. And our conversation is about how have values changed, and indeed, how has the world changed, and how would we navigate it differently? So we're looking at before, present, and after. With me are the esteemed, well, let me go one by one and ask each of you introduce yourselves. So as you appear on the screen, going clockwise, Neil, would you kindly introduce yourself in any way you wish, please?
Oh, that's interesting. I'm sure there's a lot of people around the world that would leap at that one. I'm Neil Hawkes. Basically, I'm a teacher. I'm very proud to be a teacher, and I go around listening to people more now. I love listening to people and learning from people such as the colleagues who are on the call today. I think the world needs far more listeners now. We've got enough speakers. So I try to do my fair share of listening and really understanding where other people are coming from. So I have an open mindset, and so that's a little bit about me. So I always like to be described as a teacher because I've been involved in teaching all my life, just about.
So a teacher who is involved, who has deep listening at the core.
Well, some would say yes, but it's emerging. I think, I was talking with people the other day about things like wisdom, and they say, "Oh, Neil, you're wise." And I said, "No, I'm not. We are only on a journey towards that, because values tend to be verbs, in my view, rather than nouns. They're something you're aspiring to, and we're all fallible, unless you're a narcissist who thinks you're, the perfect addition. But during my learning as a learner, because I think teachers are learners, I think you learn from all sorts of people, and it helps you to be reflective. So a whole heap of my work has been how you bring a reflective capacity to consciousness, so people, before they speak, just have that moment or two of reflection, thinking about, so that they can guide their thinking and behavior, which is my definition of what a value is. Anyway, I'm talking too much now. This is only an introduction.
Well, wonderful. Thank you for defining values for us. And you're joining us from the UK. So great to have you with us. Thank you. Now over to Bob, who I believe is joining us from Eastern United States.
Yep.
Bob, if you could introduce yourself in any way you wish, please.
Sure. So I have my background in engineering, multiple degrees in engineering. I worked in the consumer products and aerospace industry for about a total of 15 years. And in those capacities, I was a manager in engineering, supply chain management, and manufacturing. And after that time, I left to go work in academia, whereas I was a professor. I was there for 23 years. I retired recently, and I've been awarded the honor of Professor Emeritus. And so one of the things my area of focus has been is leadership and specific questions related to people trying to fix leadership, fix leaders' way of thinking, fix leaders' way of doing things, and why oftentimes those types of prescriptions have little effect. And so this is currently the area that I continue to look at in retirement as well.
I can see we're going to have a very deep conversation if this is your study and area of interest. Thank you so much, Bob. And now over to you, Richard. I believe you're joining us from Italy.
Correct. I'm in the hills of Tuscany, the sunny hills of Tuscany, and today is quite hot. So I've got my air conditioning on, which I don't often have, but anyhow, I thought, well, it's going to be a sweaty meeting, so I better switch on the air conditioning. So who am I? I've been struggling with that question for many lifetimes. And in this particular lifetime, I'm beginning to realize that I'm simply an aspect of the one mind. And what is the one mind? The one mind is a universal energy field of which we are all an aspect. And that has been, that revelation or that embodiment has come to me quite recently, and working from that space has changed my life enormously, and I'll talk about that later. But we're going to be talking about values. Yes, this journey, this latter part of my life, the journey began by inventing a way of uh, measuring consciousness or measuring culture by mapping values to an extension of Maslow's model that I developed called the 7 levels of personal consciousness, 7 levels of organizational consciousness. And of course, to link up with Bob, there were 7 levels of leadership consciousness. So I'm going to be interested to listen to what Bob has to say. One word about Neil. Neil and I have been friends for a long, long time. And I liked what he said about where he is. He's listening. And what actually the word I think is, he's a presence. He's not only a gift, he's a presence. And by listening, he creates a field of presence which allows other people to be who they really are without inflicting on them anything of his own, but just holding the space for them to grow and develop. And he's always been like that, but I don't think he's ever defined himself as a presence, and he is a presence, and that's how I see him.
So a presence and a present. So thank you, Richard. I love that. I like the way you brought everyone in together. So I'll just quickly introduce myself and then take it a step further. I'm Dr. Mandeep Rai, the author of The Values Compass. And I think this is why perhaps Asif asked me to moderate this conversation. In The Values Compass, we look at values from around the world. And it's a journey outward, but really to take a journey inward. And I feel that with Neil, we'll be doing that through listening. With Bob, we'll be looking outwards at leadership. And with Richard, we'll be doing both, but also some soul work. Now, where did this brainchild begin? Well, Dr. Asif Chowdhury, Richard Barrett, and myself, and many others actually from the values community, were in Bali around in 2023. And in fact, this was hatched in Ubud. We were there because the G20 was there, and some of us are the founders of the Values 20, the V2V. And when you're talking about values, you begin to realize that everything, all our decisions, our impulses, the kind of the drumbeat of life, the long term and the short term, are defined by our values. And so when we're looking at the past, the present, and the future, as is the agenda for today, I feel as though we're really having a discovery call. So one that heals perhaps the past, brings us into the present, and can create a more hopeful future. Without putting words into anyone's mouth, we are going through a very turbulent time right now. So with that, Neil, have you turned to deep listening recently for a reason?
That's a very interesting question. I think, as Richard was saying, you know, I've always been interested in listening. That started with my grandmother. She influenced me incredibly as a young child. Parents were out working, but I spent a lot of time with her. And I think the listening started with her because she was an incredible person with a wonderful presence. So I think it started with her. I've always been a people watcher. Whenever I'm doing a presentation, I always pause at the beginning to look at the people in front of me, you know, just to realize where everybody is coming from. I've tried over the years to not act from an ego base. I'm very fortunate to be married to a psychotherapist who Richard knows quite well, Jane, and Jane is an incredible intellect, and she doesn't let me get away with anything. So that has been incredibly helpful, particularly in my thinking and work in recent years, which has gone in various directions. I was recently in Iceland, and I was fortunate enough to be in the presence of the president of Iceland. and she is a tremendous person. And she was talking about the well-being economy that many of us feel needs to replace this broken system that we are in at the moment. And she made this remark. She said, the way out for humanity is in. And so many of us realize that it's not in what we do in the world, it's who we are in the world that makes the difference. And unless you've done sufficient work on your internal family of parts, aspects of your character, then you're not really going to influence other people. So the journey is one of authenticity, being the person that's the real you. Because I always feel that that's people who have influenced me have been acting from that base. And I work very hard at being that myself. I'm not suggesting I'm 100% there, but I'm working to it. So I don't know if I answered your question then, but I do believe, I've been in this world of values work. There was a time when someone said, Neil, you invented it. Richard is only slightly older than me. So I've been around, but of course we have to acknowledge Aristotle and a few other minor philosophers having got there first. But I do think the purpose of education, as he said, is a moral one. And I'll come on to leadership, Bob's area, a little later, because I think what we've been doing, some of us, by developing values with young people, is now having an effect on our thinking in leadership. So enough from me.
Wonderful. Actually, I feel like we should jump into leadership as we move over to you, Bob, because it's really interesting that when Neil was speaking, I was thinking about the intellectual part of ourselves, the emotional part of ourselves, our physical selves and our spiritual selves. And I do love the president of our Iceland. It actually has become a country that has more startups than almost any other nation in Europe. And I think that ability to express, to create, and where I think the president and the prime minister are both female, it's just a wonderful energy there right now. Richard often says that the future should be female. Let's see. But it's wonderful to see that we are seeing a shift in leadership in some places, and yet a different form of leadership in other places. So, Bob, you're talking to us from Eastern United States.
Yeah.
Tell us, what are your reflections currently and for the future regarding leadership?
Well, one of the things that's interesting about leadership is how we have these models of great leadership, and how often those models are ineffective in influencing other leaders. And so one of the things I look at is why is that the case? Why are these stellar models of leadership? And I look primarily in business, but you can obviously extend it over to political realms and nonprofits and things like that, educational settings, educational leaders, and so on. And generally speaking, these examples of great leadership that are legitimate, that undergo scrutiny, and it's not just a puff piece story in various magazines and so on. Those tend to not be very influential, and leaders tend to stick to what I call classical management, which is rooted in ancient origins, going back, probably sometime after the Neolithic Revolution, where you have the conceptions of leadership rooted in the idea of leadership rooted in preconceptions. And so people tend to lead as they have been led in the past, and these kind of anomalies that we see don't have quite the influence that you would expect, and they're brushed off by the leaders who are devoted to classical management. And so I look at something called progressive management, and the history of that. The management history is very interesting to figure out why current forms of progressive management and the associated leadership thinking and practices have had very little influence in the world for over 100 years. So if we want to make progress with leadership, we need to understand, not just, in my opinion, just praise these leaders, but we need to understand why their influence, in my view, is quite lacking, and why classical management and associated leadership thinking and routines retains its power after all these years. And one of the things that's important to look at is the political leadership of ancient Egypt. And so books are written on this, and because they wrote things down, they were the first civilization to really document things. You see similar things today as you saw 5,000 years ago. And that sounds like a long time, but it's only 166 generations. So how we think today, how some leaders think today, whether it's political or business or other, has a lot of similarities, and in some instances exactly the same as 5,000 years ago. So this is just a really weird phenomenon that is fascinating.
I love that you're taking such a wide lens. Are there some specific examples of lessons learned from the past that we should now be utilizing in the future?
The lesson learned is that we repeat the past remarkably well. And it seems to be just sort of, we're a lot of our conception of leadership is, I think, run by the amygdala in our brain, in our sense of flight or fight and so forth. And so we're structured mentally in a way that causes us to do things that are similar to those in the past. I used to, the graduate students that I used to teach in my leadership course, I would ask them, how many good leaders have you had? And we had some rough definition around it, not specific, but how many good leaders you had and how many bad leaders you had. And typical answer was 10 to 20% were good, and 80, 90% were bad for various reasons, because the leaders made lots of different types of mistakes and so on. And so, but what you see is that the good leaders would get sidelined, they wouldn't get promoted to higher level and so on, and they just sort of fade out of the picture over time. And they didn't fit in with the social norms and preconceptions of the so-called classical management crowd. So they were basically criticized, ostracized, and the usual stuff happening.
That's interesting, because Richard, would you say that actually some of the bad leaders are being edged out, or are we in a very different world right now because some of these leaders are able to lead in a way that gives them almost immunity?
Well, I think you said to Bob is giving a wider view. I want to give an even wider view. You see, for me, when you look at the history of human civilization, you can see an evolution of worldviews. And that began with the hunter-gatherers and then the tribalism, and then we moved into what I call state awareness, which was pretty chaotic, like in the Roman times and the Greek times. And then we moved into what I call nation awareness, which is pretty much exemplified by the British system of empire building and top-down management. And then we move into wealth awareness, where another whole worldview, which you see very dominant in the USA at the moment. And then beyond that, we move into what I call people awareness, which is what we see in the Scandinavian countries, and why Iceland has women as leaders. And beyond that, there's something else coming up called humanity awareness. And I think a person who exemplified that was the lady who was in charge of New Zealand. I can't quite remember her name, but no, she's no longer. So
Jacinda Ardern.
Yes, thank you very much. So when we say good and bad, it's not a good way of saying it. Does the leader fit the worldview of that particular country? And if the world leader fits that worldview, the general consensus will be that is a good leader. Now, for some people, and I hate to say this, Donald Trump is a good leader. For some people, but that's because the level of consciousness they're operating says, yeah, this is our man. And so leadership is a very fluid thing in terms of judging it and making characteristics about it. So if you look at leadership in the Scandinavian countries, it's very different to in that arena of people awareness than if you look at leaders in wealth awareness, or if you look in leaders in terms of nation awareness. So leadership is a very fluid concept, and good and bad really don't apply, because the judgment is coming from the worldview that you operate in. And I would say that we don't have very many leaders that I would actually even wish to meet or spend time with, except these leaders who are at the cutting edge of consciousness, like in people awareness. And guess what? These countries that are there are choosing women as leaders.
Mhm.
And for me, that's hugely significant, because it represents another level of consciousness, which is a more caring level, a more empathetic level, a more compassionate level, which I think really is what leadership is about. So I think, incidentally, I feel like I have to mention this, a little break. I've got a book coming out called The New Leader, and then we'll keep going.
Yeah, I would say, though, that
So,
the boundary conditions on good and bad leadership in my course were defined as the type of mistakes that leaders make. So it's a follower's perspective of what constitutes a good leader. And so one of the perspectives you have is what constitutes a good golfer. Well, it's somebody who makes the least number of mistakes. What constitutes a good musician? You're not going to go see Coldplay and pay $500 for tickets and say, well, it's okay if they screw up a few songs. So there are some boundary conditions applied to make the judgment, which is what people do, is they make judgments on what constitutes, good, bad, better, worse,
But Bob,
framework.
the judgment is coming from somebody who is operating at a particular worldview and level of consciousness. So it's not a judgment that holds any significance, because it's coming from a particular consciousness. So again, good and bad just don't apply to this discussion.
True, but that the consciousness comes from a group of people that form a judgment on what constitutes good leadership.
Yeah, but that consciousness represents the consciousness of the worldview that they were brought up in. It's not an ultimate thing. It's like, if you were brought up in Roman times and you lived in Roman times, you would say these Roman leaders, you'd be shouting, yeah, 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 a bit like the consciousness of the people who voted for Donald Trump.
Yeah,
So
and so within that framework, they have a judgment about what constitutes good leadership and bad leadership.
That's exactly my point. And so
and that's my point to the boundary conditions that I put on my students.
Well, then,
okay, so if we were to step away from good and bad, for example, and just think about the states of consciousness, if we were to think that gaining materially is one state of consciousness, but ultimately, even to gain materially, you would want as many people as possible to benefit. And so there to be some level of equality. So for the people to go to that next stage of consciousness, and then that humanity stage that we mentioned that New Zealand was operating at. Now, what's interesting is, what kind of a world have we created where that leader of New Zealand wished to step down? I think that's a question we need to ask ourselves. So Neil, can I ask you to address that maybe?
Well, it's interesting. I spent more time in New Zealand over the last 12 months than I have in the UK. So, I'm very conscious of the politics in New Zealand and how it swings from so-called left to so-called right, and people, when they fear that their shares are going down a bit, then they want to lurch to conservatism in all its various guises.
But didn't she step down before we passed over?
She stepped down for a multitude of reasons, family reasons as well as political ones. I think it was mainly she wanted more time with her children, because she'd had the baby, and she wanted more time, and that shows her humanity too. I do agree with Richard's work. I followed his work for many years as he's followed mine, and what I discovered many years ago, if I go back to where I started on this values journey, I was had a senior education post in the UK, and I had visited many, many schools, not only in the UK but abroad too. And I was coming to the conclusion that children were more and more entering education without what I called an ethical vocabulary. They were given in schools a mathematical vocabulary, a scientific vocabulary, but no one sort of said, well, how about these other words, you know? And therefore we saw that being played out in behavior terms, selfishness and the me, the I sort of thing, and children developing a worldview that they are the center of the world and everyone else should revolve around them. So I thought, well, you know, to cut a very long story short, I thought, what would happen if we inducted children into an ethical vocabulary in a systematic way? Would there be any results? Or, as some people at the time said to me, Neil, you're just an idealist, you know, this is all Tommy rot, to use an English expression. But I persevered, and I left that post, and I found myself to be a principal head teacher of a large school just outside Oxford. And I ran an experiment to see what would happen if you inducted. And at the same time, I teamed up with Oxford University, and we ran a research program for 7 years to see what would happen. And at the end of that 7, we were blown away. I exceeded my expectations. That's why I'm so passionate now. That's why I go around the world talking about this. It's so bloody obvious, to use another English expression. But
bloody or obvious.
Yeah. But it's threatening, you see. You know, there are politicians around the world that don't like me. When Asif invited me to speak at the United Nations, you know, you could feel, ooh, what's this about? Because it threatens people's status there where they are. Anyway, to go back to the original story, you know, our research was written up. The biggest effect, though, was on adults initially. Adults found that their relationships, and values work is all about relationships. It develops good relationships. That's the number one thing, with yourself and other people. But going on to this leadership thing, this is what I want to go to. What the research pointed to at that time, and Professor Lovett in Australia in his more bigger research than I did, what we were showing was that it develops children's agency, their control of themselves. And I've worked with people like Andre Stupo, who's a Fulbright scholar, and various others. And I've developed this notion of what I call ethical intelligence, which I define as the ability to ethically self-regulate your own behavior. You know, Richard, you've mentioned Donald Trump several times in this work. You know, just imagine if Donald was working from a base of ethical intelligence. You know, it would change the whole game right across the world. So what I'm finding now, you know, in my research of children that have been, and I've been in schools this week. If children are inducted into values work and they have experience of working with the values, not just talking about them, they have to do something, then they become ethically intelligent at various levels, and they become ethical leaders of themselves and then other people. So the whole basis of leadership is actually going inwards to yourself, asking you. I'm very lucky. I was researched by someone from Oxford University on my leadership some years ago, so I understand what sort of leader I am. So leadership starts with schools, with universities, with all of us actually interrogating what that means for us and how we're going to lead ourselves first. How do I lead myself? Not what sort of leader I'm going to be. And when I'm talking to big companies, I always say the first thing you do on leadership when you are a leader is tell other people around you what your core values are. Because most people in organizations try and guess at your values because you never tell them. So if you believe in integrity, say, this is one of my core values as a leader, and I will expect you lot to be honest. So don't come to me with you. So it makes it quite clear. So that's my take on leadership. But it goes, as I say, to my current research, which is on ethical leadership. Pause.
Wonderful. So that's not just leadership. You're talking about how to shape the future. That before we can get to values-based leadership, we need values-based education. And then we know about values-based leadership. Thank you so much, Neil. So passing the mic over to you, Bob, if we're thinking about the future, what do you think we need to get that type of leadership that you are speaking of?
Well, I think we have to talk about the past a little bit, what was just said. You may have seen the thing of recently at the Coldplay concert where some married man was hugging the head of HR and caught on the kiss cam and so forth. So leaders are prone to say, I value this, I value that, and so forth in public. But behind the scenes, it's a very different story. So one of the things that I'm always interested in is why we have this gap between what they say and what they actually do. I'm also interested in why, when we train people to have certain values and think in certain ways, that when they enter certain environments, they capitulate to the norms of whatever those values happen to be. And a simple example is we would have an industry advisory board in our program at the university, and they would always tell us, "Oh, you guys, you need to teach students better teamwork," and so forth. Kids nowadays, my children's generation, they're 35 now or so, they were taught teamwork from elementary school through university. And then they get into industry, and that unravels. And one of the ways it unravels is because the leaders in the companies tend to blame people for problems. They don't look at processes. They're still basing their view of people based upon preconceptions that people lower in status down in the organization are the ones that make the problems. And the people higher up in the organization don't make any of these kinds of problems for the people lower in the organization. No, I'm not a full-time, or I was then a full-time academic, but not a career academic. And so I was in industry, and I was in management positions in 3 different functional areas, so they can't say you only know about engineering or something stupid like that. So I would call them out on it, and they have no response to it because they themselves don't want to change. And their leadership is rooted in preconceptions. And they are led by the people who influenced them earlier on. And those leaders were also, I'm in charge, I know what's right, and the people who make mistakes are the ones at the bottom. So the kind of shift in leadership, that the first step is to move away from preconceptions to sensory perceptions. When you're talking to somebody, look at how they're reacting. Not thinking, oh, this is just somebody in the receiving well taken in packages, any idiot can do that. So until you make that jump from this legacy, this long legacy, 5,000 years or more legacy of preconceptions and what I call the natural social order. And of course, at the top of the natural social order is God, and at the bottom is Satan. And in between, there are monarchs and politicians and salaried and hourly labor, and the poor and the indolent and the infirmed and criminals and so forth. And so until you move away from the preconception view of leadership, you're not going to make much progress. And so people, our students, undergrads and grads, get absorbed into these businesses. And of course, not all the leaders think this way. Some are more oriented towards sensory perceptions of what's happening, human sensory perceptions, but a lot aren't, because they enjoy all the status, rights, and privileges and protections that come with being someone in high status. So that's what fascinates me, is how this stuff gets undone, and why people, there's a vast sea of people like leaders must do this, they should do that, leaders can no longer think this way, and so forth. But leaders reserve the right and privilege to ignore all that until they have their own epiphany or not.
I love that how you all have had literally 2 or 3 generations of research and work gone into this, because you've all been, you know, you've been here for the past, future and present, and in some cases that's 30, 40, 50 years or more. So thank you for that view. Richard, in your view, do you feel, what could we do in the future to make it a more hopeful one regarding leadership?
I think I have to look at Neil. He's the man of the future, because he knows how to teach children this ethical construct, and therein lies the key to the future, in my opinion. And as he mentioned, leading self. 15 years ago, I wrote a book, The New Leadership Paradigm. Leading self, leading a team, leading an organization, and leading in society. But it all began with leading self. And there are different aspects to leading self if you dig deeper. Not just values, but what are those values focused on? Because as we grow in consciousness, our values change. We seem to think that values are fixed, but they're not. As we get older and as we grow and develop, our values change. And so if we pick up on, I've recently modified Keegan's model from the unconscious mind to the self-actualizing mind, to the self-realizing mind, and to the transcendent mind. That basically follows Keegan's work, except for the last stage, which goes beyond what an academic could really talk about, because you can't talk about the one mind in universities because they really have no idea what you're talking about, and you'll get thrown out. So I'm sorry to say, Bob, I'm not really a big fan of academia, because academia.
Neither am I.
Yeah, good. Well, good. We agreed on that, because it tends to, you know, in order to get something new, you have to have peer review, and of course the peer review is all about people who may not have elevated their thinking to a new level. And so the great thinkers like Carl Jung in terms of psychology, Abraham Maslow, Roberto Assagioli, who all understood that psychology could not really be discussed without discussing the role of the soul. And that leads me into what I talked about earlier, which was the unconscious mind, the self-actualizing mind, the self-realizing mind, and then the transcendent mind. Because in the unconscious mind, there are many, many people around who mostly operate unconsciously, and I'm sorry to say again, many of these people have voted for Trump. And then comes the self-actualizing mind. These are people who take charge of themselves and will have this ethical construct that you talk about, Neil, and will go out and do something with their lives, but they'll do it in a manner that builds trust and has values. But after the self-actualizing mind comes the self-realizing mind, and this is what Maslow began to think about in his later years, which wasn't about how do you become the best person you can become in the external world, but how can you become the best you can become in your own internal world. And this leads you obviously to the soul, and that's what Carl Jung talked about, Assagioli talked about, even Maslow talked about it in slightly different terms. And beyond this self-realizing mind comes the transcendent mind, which is like where you recognize actually it's not about you, it's about your gift to the world, and that brings you back to the soul. What is my gift to the world? And so I don't care whether you're a leader or anybody, I mean, who you are. The question really is, what is your gift to the world and how are you going to give it? Because that's where the future lies. And what Neil is doing, he's preparing this new generation to get to that point. He's preparing them for self-realizing mind, whereas all of the forces outside are preparing them for the self-actualizing mind. Like how can I become a banker? How can I become this? How can I? But when you get into values, you can't escape the idea of the sense of the self-realizing mind, about becoming the best you can internally. And this is now seeping through into what they call the inner development goals. We all know about the sustainable development goals, and then people say, well, you know, you're not going to get there unless we change the way we think. And so they started thinking about the inner development goals. And I've been watching that development. And recently I did a critique on that, or a critique which was supportive in a way of a way forward, which I put out on LinkedIn. And to my amazement, it got over 17,000 views. And obviously I hit a chord. And what I was really saying was, it's not as simple as you're making out in the inner development goals. It's much more complicated than that. And in a way, it's this inner work which is the most important, and in the inner work that actually characterizes somebody as a leader, because that person will have followers. And that's the key to leadership, is to have followers. Now, if we look at history, well, there were some good old subjects like Jesus Christ and Buddha, and they had lots of followers, and they still do. Why? Because they became role models, not just for values-based leadership, but for deep, profound leadership. And what we mentioned before, Neil, listening, presence. They had that presence, and people were attracted to that because that's who they are deeply on the inside, at the level of the soul. They see with the soul in other people, and they're attracted to that, and they want to be like that. And that, for me, is almost an unconscious leader, somebody who paves the way to a new way of being. We sadly need that in our organizations and in our political world. And I think the Scandinavians are absolutely showing us the way, because they managed to elect women who don't have that strong ego. I mean, the problems of the world are really old ego-driven men. That's what it's all about. I mean, we need to replace them. They're going to die, and we need to replace them with people who are more evolved, and particularly women who don't suffer. Not all of them, some do. Don't suffer from these ego machinations that says I have to be the best in the world rather than the best for the world.
So while you guys
I love
and many,
how much.
sorry,
Go ahead, Bob.
well, I was just going to say, while you guys and many others are doing great work, my concern is the past is ever present, and things seem to go in cycles, and people get pulled back into archaic ways of thinking. So when you have the self-realizing mind and the transcendent mind and so forth, what's the mechanism that destroys that and pulls people back into, is it just they die off over time? How do you break the cycle versus blind versus a blind drift, blind evolution, things just sort of change over time because circumstances change and people evolve in their thinking.
Bob, these are not cycles. We're living in a spiral, and a spiral is not a cycle. A spiral, it goes up, and as you move up that spiral, you encounter the same old problems, but you deal with them differently. And if you look at the evolution of consciousness over the past 10,000 years, we're in a spiral. And so to insist that we're just recycling is not true. In my opinion, it's far from true. I mean, if you look back 100, 200 years, many things in the world now are not the same. And so if you even look
agreed.
Okay, so we're in a spiral, not in a cycle.
Really how people are thinking, not the material world.
So anyway, I think we're talking. Yeah, what we're talking about, I think, is a upward facing vortex. So yes, it's circular, but a vortex upwards is our aim. Our aim is to have humanity evolve. Well,
not always upwards.
Well, the point is that our aim is that you might take 2 steps forward to go 2 steps forward and 1 step back, but the aim is to always to go upwards. I feel as though we've covered a lot of ground.
It could be more like a random walk.
Yeah. Can I add that there are some incredible tools that people can use. I mentioned my wife Jane earlier on. One of my dear friends is Dick Schwartz. Dick Schwartz is the founder of the internal family systems method of psychotherapy, which is the #1 growth area in the world as far as psychotherapy is concerned. If you go onto my foundation, the IVET Foundation's website, you can listen to Dick and I talking. I won't go into his psychotherapy approach, but what it does is help people to understand their internal world and how that is constructed. Richard mentioned Jung. Well, Jung talked about aspects of personality, and Richard has really develop that into helping people think about the parts of their personality, how they develop mainly in childhood, how that then forms their worldview, etc., etc. And I think having, I always say to teachers, we can be just a cohort on our own. We must learn from others and listen to others. So bring in your psychotherapists, bring in your philosophers, bring in other people, because over the last 200 years, one of the great problems humanity has faced is, if we had been the educated people 200 years ago, we would just about have known everything. Now it's all been put into little silos, and that's what gives politicians great power, because they can cherry pick. And that's why I agree with Richard about academics. If I'm a politician, I might choose to follow Bob, but I might say, no, I don't want Bob, so I choose someone else. So, but going back to the tools thing, that's what we're helping children to understand. A simple thing like pausing. I've written a paper on pausing, but that ability to be still, we haven't, in this talk, we haven't taken a moment for silence. Silence is an incredible good friend. It rechecks the conversation. So if you're in a classroom, people might bubble up like we've been in this conversation. You perhaps just have a symbol or something that triggers people to take that moment or two of silence. And in that moment, you're then able to go into your internal world and ask yourself that, well, what am I doing in this process at the moment? Am I gaining from my lesson? Am I listening? What am I doing? And then after a brief pause, you can then restart without saying, oh, now what were you thinking about? But you restart because you've rechecked where you are. Think about leadership. Think about everything that happens if leaders generally just took a pause, just had a silence. I've been doing that for many years, and I'm not a great thinker or anything like that about it, but it's improved the little bit that I've had, and I see it in children. I think if you help them have an ethical vocabulary, give them time for pause and reflection, whole heap of other things like good meals and exercise and heaven knows what. But if you do those basic things, you give them the tools in order to be where Richard's going, this self-actualized person that we need in the future. If we don't get there, then I can be a bit gloomy. And as I have grandchildren, I look at them and I think, I want them to have a future. Let's really come to terms with this. But vested interest in structures means that systems remain as they are, although they are broken. And somehow we have to make this transition from one system to the next. And you do that by being the new system in the present. So I'm being what I want the future to be. And that's by doing that, you drag the past into the future. And that's what we all need to do.
I think that's a wonderful place to pause, a wonderful place to take a breath, to reflect on the journey we've had. It's been a 5,000-year journey, a very long journey, but also a journey inwards. And I think we all agree that that's where we need to head in order to make the progress we wish to make, which is where we have perhaps more feminine leadership, more nurturing leadership, and a leadership that's willing to listen, to care, and to take the whole of humanity with itself. Yeah. So thank you all very much. It's been a wonderful conversation, and there'll be more episodes like this taking us even further.
Thank you.
Thank you all very much.
Mandy.
Thank you.
Yep.
Thank you.
Great to be with you all.
Likewise.